Hi folks, I gave a talk a week ago or so on tips on how to help loved ones get out of repressed memory pseudoscience. I'm going to give some of that talk today. I'm going to leave out some of the details that I thought was relevant for the audience of some parents of people who had lost their offspring, become estranged from their offspring, usually due to some kind of psychotherapy involving repressed memory ideas or trauma dissociation, something like that. So what I'm going to do is just skip to the second part of the talk that I gave and talk about ideas that I have from my own experience. I used to believe in repressed memory theory, and then I came around, and that kind of shapes what I'm saying here. Before I get to that list of advice, I just want to say that as a disclaimer that this is really specific to my ideas based on my experience, and my research since then has probably shaped it as well. My journey in philosophy of science has shaped it in a certain way, which I don't think you have to copy that to have success at helping people figure out how to think critically. I think there's other ways of framing it. So I think some of the audience I had at the British False Memory Society actually knew more than me in some areas, and I was aware of that as I was giving the talk, and some of the audience here might have more knowledge than me, and then you can just pass on that knowledge to me, and I'll kind of formulate my ideas like an empiricist as to just modifying some of my ideas that I come up with. So this is just starting a conversation, and I love for these ideas to be modified. All right, so advice on how to help loved ones stuck in the repressed memory prison is how I worded it. Now, the modern terminology may not be repressed memory, so it might be a trauma dissociation prison of belief, or a dissociative identity disorder prison of belief. But let me just talk about it. So if you are a parent who has lost somebody like a son or a daughter to these belief systems in which they reappraise their childhood as being much more traumatic than it was, or much more negative than it was, how do you get them back? Well, first of all, I should say to try, right? So this is point number one, to try to make an attempt to help your offspring realize what's true, or help them, give them information that they can read or whatever that helps them make progress. But then after you've made an attempt to take planned breaks that go on for a long time, maybe a year, maybe 6 months, where you don't try, so where you have a break from it, where you enjoy your life to your fullest, where you forget the burdens of having a child, even if it's a grown child, you kind of forget about that and enjoy your life, mold your life in a way that is very meaningful, do what you need to do to enjoy your life, and so on. And then set a date for when you retry to contact your estranged child, which will probably be an adult child at this point, and then take a break again for another 6 months or another year or whatever. And then my suggestion, and this is very personal, is to just carry on doing that every year for decades. And the reason I say that is I feel that if we have a responsibility to our offspring to at least try and help them out of some kind of mental prison that they're in. Not that we should hurt ourselves in that attempt to help people out of a kind of cult-like thinking or an unfalsifiable belief system. But I think we have some obligation to try, I don't know, maybe once a year in a very warm way, a very supportive way, a very useful way, so that if you do manage to get through to them, you do it in such a way that they say, oh, thank you for sending me that book or that video or that information, and I think it's worth trying just for your own good, so if you are a parent who's lost a child to a belief system, it's just good for you to make an attempt and then forget about it. It's good to say what you want to say in a letter or an email or in a face-to-face meeting or whatever, because I think we all feel that we've got something to say, especially when something this happens. And I think it's generally a good thing to say what we want to say, as long as it's communicated in a civil way, as civil as you can make it. I don't mean being dishonest. You can be very honest and say it civilly without anger and so on. Number 2 advice is to take an authoritative approach to dealing with this problem of an estranged adult child. And that is, you set firm boundaries, you're very warm, and you're very communicative. That approximately is the authoritative approach to parenting. So set firm boundaries. You don't agree to anything that's false. For example, you don't accept things that are very bad behavior. You don't encourage them, but in that firmness, you're very warm and very full of communication, right? So long conversations, long letters, full communication of helping people out, helping children out of belief systems and so on, rather than a permissive approach where you don't have a backbone and you permit anything from your offspring, or an authoritarian approach, which is very strict and very low warmth and very small amounts of communication. So you don't want to be, authoritarian or permissive. And there is some great cross-cultural research on psychology. I know psychology sometimes doesn't produce good literature, but there's good cross-cultural research showing that authoritativeness in parenting works much better than authoritarian or permissive. So authoritative approach is the best way to go, because it leads to better outcomes of attainment, creativity, motivation, and so on, all around the world. Okay, step number 3. Set rules up front about how you're going to communicate, such as set rules with the person you're trying to connect with that you will have free speech. Both parties will have free speech in this conversation, and lots of it. And the discussion will be involve civil discourse without anger, without shouting, without shutting down people before they finish a sentence, without walking away from the conversation too early. So one of the rules could be not to walk away from the conversation before 50 minutes is up, let's say, in the first conversation. And you could do this on Zoom in recent times, or probably better would be to meet in person. But maybe the first attempt at a conversation could be on Zoom or in email, and so on. But you could set up the rules for the conversation, such as not interrupting on with email messages or so on, and then you could have the conversation after the rules have been set up. And just think about the practicalities. I think this is one of the things that people don't think about enough, is that it's actually really difficult for families that do get along to find time to talk, right? Because they don't want to talk, or they're working 6 days a week and the timing doesn't match. So I think one of the big problems that I think we don't analyze enough of is how practically are you going to meet? What day? What time? What time does your offspring who's estranged have off? What way do they like to talk? So, and another thing that occurs to me here is to set it up in such a way that is very respectful to them. Just think about them as, how would you approach an academic that you wanted to set up a talk with, right? Think about how you would not demand that it be in a certain place. You would ask them, where do you want it to be? If you were asking a stranger where you would like to have a discussion or something. Would you turn up on the doorstep of an academic to have a talk uninvited? Probably not. that might be the last resort, that if all else fails, you might knock on your offspring's door if everything else has failed, to try and have a civil conversation, of course. And okay, so set the rules up front, free speech, lots of it. That's number 3. Number 4 is falsifiability, right? Just the idea that at the core of the problem may be a lack of understanding that their belief that they have that their trauma explains every symptom or every tiredness, every ache and pain, all the problems in their adult life that childhood trauma causes all of that, is a theory that does actually explain everything. The only problem with it is that theories that explain everything are not necessarily correct or good. In fact, theories like that you don't allow to be tested are unfalsifiable. So the offspring that you're trying to contact may be keeping their theory of what happened in childhood unfalsifiable by not talking to you. So by having the opportunity to create a dialogue, and of course you've got to allow them to say everything they think that was wrong in their childhood and listen. In fact, there's a good, even if it doesn't involve false memories, this is a good thing to do, I think, with reconnecting with offspring. There's a good video by Larry Elder that I might link in the description below, where he talks about how he reconnected with his father with a long tirade of everything that his father did wrong. And then even, the father kind of agreed, and they made up. So this is different from false memory cases, of course, but what's similar is just allowing both parties to talk freely without interruption for a few sentences, let's say, and then have a back and forth. Because the idea with this is so that if you have a back and forth conversation civilly, where you do debate, and it will be an argument in the sense that it's a logical argument. There's no shouting, there's no harsh disagreement, but it will be an argument in the same way that science has an argument about what's true, right? So you can't avoid that. It's going to be argumentative, but you have to keep it civil, and that's the main point. Anyway, back to point number 4 of falsifiability. So they may have a belief that is unfalsifiable in their basic theory, such as repressed memories cause all of neurosis. How do you measure repressed memories accurately? How do you measure neurosis or psychopathology accurately? Well, they don't. It's just a unfalsifiable theory that is set in stone like an axiom, where all of their attempts to investigate that is just confirmation. They just look for confirmation only. So I think this lack of falsifiability, the lack of the idea that a good theory is something that you should be able to test, that it should be open to refutation, that, so being open to refutation means that precise measurement, or in the terms of figuring out what happened in the past, it means being open to discussion, right? So if you stop your family from talking to you, there's no chance of your theory of why you had problems at age 23. It's no chance of your theory of ever being debunked, right? And you want the child to understand that it's good to open yourself up to falsifying evidence. So there's different levels of analysis here, isn't there? The vague theory is unfalsifiable. The beliefs that the offspring hold are unfalsifiable if they don't allow anybody to talk to them. They become falsifiable if they allow discussion, right? So they might hold the belief that this strange abuse happened, and there's just something ready to be said by the parents that would debunk that, but there's an avoidance of that the refuting evidence. So this is what I think is at the core of people who have fallen for cultic psychotherapies or for repressed memory kind of psychotherapies, where there's a big distortion of what actually happened. I think at the core of it is falsifiability. I think the reason I talk about this so much is I really believe that if you do not ground your offspring in critical thinking of some way, and it doesn't have to be falsifiability, but I think of it in terms of falsifiability. If you don't ground them in testability, falsifiability, the danger is that they abandon a belief in their trauma therapy that they used to believe in. They may not even believe in that much anymore. The danger is that they stop believing in that, and then they start believing in some other crazy pseudoscience, such as extreme dietary ideas, or some conspiratorial beliefs about the medical system or something like that. So I just feel that if you are able to somehow get better critical thinking into your offspring, the result will be not jumping around from one pseudoscience to another, like jumping from the frying pan into the fire, and so on. Because that can lead to continued estrangement. It can lead to a lot of stress when you have one family member who doesn't think critically. It can just create a lot of stress in people who care for them. Another part of falsifiability is this idea that I've been developing since I first learnt about it in 2006 and 2007, is that it's very often an underlying hidden cause of family estrangement, and it's also linked to cultic types of belief systems and authoritarianism, especially left-wing authoritarianism. So that's something I'm just communicating so that maybe when the time is right, you can pass that idea on to your offspring. So in other words, a lack of falsifiability leads to estrangement in Scientology as well as repressed memory therapy. It leads to estrangement from family politically, when somebody goes off on a extreme unfalsifiable belief system in politics, and then their family doesn't agree with them, and then there's estrangement. So I think that, falsifiability is at the bottom of cultic belief systems and estrangement from family. Sometimes, parents are not very approachable themselves if they are also not good critical thinkers. So that's a pattern I've seen since 2007 in all sorts of movements, and I have not lost that. I've seen that pattern a lot, and my beliefs in seeing that connection between falsifiability and cultic ideas or authoritarianism has survived, 14 years of observations. I always, when I see a cultic movement come up on the internet or something, I can usually get to a central idea in which the proponents or the believers do not value falsifiability, and those that do value falsifiability often are the skeptics. And if you listen to the skeptics talk about these new movements, you often hear them talking about defeasibility, which is similar to falsifiability. Just a philosophical term is defeasibility, or at least they talk about measurement, validity, and a reliability of measures. Okay, move on to number 5, how to help loved ones get out of a repressed memory prison. Critical thinking, right? So related to falsifiability, critical thinking is a bigger set of tools. Falsifiability is just one tool in them, in which if they can learn that, they can start to get out of their belief systems themselves from first principles, right? So rather than say, you must believe that memory distortions are possible, it's more like, let me tell you some tools about how to think, not what to think, you know? And there's 2 books that I recommended in my talk that helped me, actually, and I still recommend them just because they're so brilliant at cutting through things in such a way that the reader makes the decisions themselves about how they want to think and whether they want to carry on believing in things that are not falsifiable. One book is called How to Think Straight About Psychology by Keith Stanovich, and any of the editions would be fine. And, you know, I'm kind of open to the idea of maybe getting a copy from Amazon and then sending it to the person who you'd like to read it. I don't know how effective that would be. That maybe it's really hard to do. I know it is something that could easily be rejected or annoy them or something, but I think you have to try set up the conversation so that, you know, you explain in a nice way why you're sending the book. And, you know, it's tough because it might end up in the trash. Anyway, so How to Think Straight About Psychology may help. Just get people on the scientific branch of psychology. That's what you want. Probably, if you've lost a child to repressed memory ideas, they probably are interested in psychology. They probably respect psychology. So one way to deal with that is maybe get them interested in the scientific side of psychology, in which has all the tools, strangely enough, has all the tools to help them out of unfalsifiable ideas in psychology. And the second book I recommend to politely and carefully send to offspring is the book Science and Pseudoscience in Clinical Psychology by Lilienfeld, Law, and Stephen Lin. It's another great book that is, you know, great for people interested in psychology, great at straightening out people's minds on how to think about what's good science and what's bad science in psychology. And I think it could, if it's received well, and I think you have to set it up in such a way that it is received well, you know, by explaining, hey, I'm sending this book because of blah, blah, and blah, and blah. And it's very important to try not to insult them in that setup. But if they do receive it well, that's something that could change their lives from first principles. In other words, they are in control of their belief system. They themselves modify their belief system. And then there is a chapter in Science and Pseudoscience on recovered memories, but it's not all about that, which is good, actually. You don't want it all to be like that. And then they decide themselves that, gosh, this is helpful. They can see the opportunity costs of what they have lost from being estranged and so on. And I think part of reuniting with the family is when it does happen, to try and bring some value to that relationship so it's worth continuing, such as, you know, warmth, a lot of communication, telling them that you're proud of them, and so on. Okay, number 6 on this list on advice how to help loved ones get out of a prison of belief is retractor stories. I think retractor stories are very powerful, so that if they read through them, they can hear how somebody talks about how they were believing in repressed memories, and then how they came across this source and then this source, and then it helped them get out. I think retractor stories, in other words, people who believed in repressed memories, believed that they were abused falsely, and then realized that they had false memories and then retracted. I think it's very useful for us trying to figure out what is it that helps people get out of this prison of belief, you know? So I used to believe in repressed memories, and for me, it was falsifiability was one of the keys. It doesn't have to be phrased that way, of course, in other cases. For other people, it might have been reading retractor stories, and then you find out this by asking retractors about how, what was it that helped them get out, So it might be a video on YouTube. In fact, one of my videos seemed to help somebody just last year, which is another thing you might think about, why not kind of figure out where the blockage is in your offspring's belief system, find a video from YouTube that helps, and then send it to them. I just think it's important to try. Anyway, going back to retractor stories, there are books that you could consider sending politely, if you can find a way to do it politely, to kin that you have lost touch with. If they're relevant, of course, such as books like My Lie by Meredith Moran. That's available on amazon.co.uk. And you might be able to have some videos on YouTube too. I think I've talked about retractor stories, not in enough detail yet, but in some of my videos I talk about legal cases. But what I think offspring might need is the long retractor stories that they can get engrossed in, case studies, where it's written as a story. I think that might help them. That might be how they got into believing that they had false memories in the first place, reading these long, vivid case studies that made them think, oh, maybe that happened to me. Well, you could do the same with retractor stories. Okay, number 7 on my list. Perhaps consider introducing them to past legal cases, and I suggest here maybe from the 1990s, so that we're separated from them, or maybe the 1980s, such as Kevin Felstead's book on his sister Carol Felstead, which is called Justice for Carol. And if you can find these legal cases written out in full form, in a kind of with a story narrative, you could consider sending them to the person that you've lost, just so that they see that false memories are possible. And as I say that, it occurs to me that you want to really find out as much as you can from the offspring that you've lost in terms of what is their worldview. Have they just reappraised childhood severely with no false memories, or have they real full-blown false memories? Do they still believe in those false memories? And that's something that a discussion might help resolve, because I think there's some cases where false memories are no longer believed, where they may just have reappraised the emotional tone of childhood, and they may not have any false memories anymore, especially if they stopped doing therapy a long time ago. Some of their beliefs might be like they're not sure about them anymore. So past legal cases, another thing to introduce offspring to that you have lost touch with. Another part of the puzzle is number 8, social psychology, kind of passing on social psychological ideas to your child that you lost, such as ideas that we use self-justification to, once we have used self-justification of our beliefs, it's very difficult to go back and change your beliefs. So that's just something that might be used, that finding might be used as kind of a crowbar to kind of get into the belief system. The findings are that if you make a public statement, you're very unlikely to go back on that belief system later. It's very difficult too, and one of the ways you can kind of undermine that is by explaining self-justification, and this is documented in a book by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. Another thing from social psychology which is useful tool to kind of explain to people of how to get out of kind of prisons of belief is confirmation bias. just explaining how everybody has confirmation bias, so that when we have a belief, we only look for confirming evidence. This is very important, right? So when you have a belief that you were abused, or that all my problems come from my relationship with families, which is not true in many false memory cases that we're talking about today, it's good for people to understand how, if you have a confirmation bias, you will not want to talk about it with somebody who could deconfirm it, right? So you want to get around that confirmation bias by talking about how confirmation bias works. And there's some good social psychology and cognitive psychology research on confirmation bias that you could look up on Google Scholar, and consider passing that on. It just depends on what kind of person you're dealing with, doesn't it? If they're an expert in confirmation bias, you don't have to explain it to them, but you might explain that that's what's going on. You might say, I think that's what might be going on here, and could we get around that confirmation bias so that you hear our ideas on this, on your theory, on your beliefs about what happened in childhood. In social psychology, under the heading number 8 still, I talk about cult-like psychotherapies are also very instructive for people to read about. So if you read about cult-like psychotherapies that are a little bit removed from the belief system that you're in, you can kind of have insights to say, oh yes, I was caught in this kind of a similar kind of system where we believed that our leader was great in psychologist. Nobody else believed that they were a great psychologist. How the whole world revolved around mimicking the therapy leader and so on. So I've got 2 books to recommend to kind of help for offspring to read, to help them get out of this occultic types of psychotherapies. And they may not have been in a cult, but they may have been in a cult-like psychotherapy, like I think repressed memory therapies sometimes like. So there's one book called Therapy Gone Mad, which I think was by Carol Mithers or something like that, which is a great book about a 1970s psychotherapy cult-like setup. And another book is called Insane Therapy. Now I recommend, which is about the same psychotherapy cult. Now I recommend that type of thing just because it helps you understand mild cults too, right? You recognize occultic mechanisms going on in regular workplaces, and even if your offspring was in a semi-cult, they can recognize the mechanisms of like adulation of a leader, unethical behavior sometimes, which is sometimes the case in repressed memory therapies or trauma dissociation, DID types of therapies, where therapists overstepping the mark sometimes, or overstepping their authority. Anyway, I think those 2 books are great, and there might be other ones out there. And at point number 9, how to help loved ones stuck in repressed memory prison. And one is, number 9 is never abandon genetic kin. Now I say this just to make the point that I don't think it will be healthy for you to do so. I think you probably feel a obligation to still help the child that you helped so much when they were a toddler. So I think it's good for them, and it's good for you to just periodically try and in between the yearly annual attempts, or the attempts every 6 months, just to never abandon genetic kin, and but to enjoy the time between your attempts. And number 10 was my idea to keep it private if you can. So keep some aspects of the dispute between you and your offspring private if you can, because it may be impossible. Every case is different, so don't worry if you think I'm wrong about this, but nobody wants to be embarrassed in public about events that they might not even believe that they still happened, right? They might be thinking it could have happened at this time, especially if it's 10 or 20 years since they had therapy. They might not even believe some of the things that they used to say, but they may still want to stay away from parents that they think are toxic. Now, I don't think the parents are actually toxic, but so keep the private complaints private if you can, but it doesn't mean that you have to be private about everything, right? So keep their name confidential, and so on. But you can, still express your ideas, your theories, you can educate the public, and with YouTube videos like I do. You can write articles for the British False Memory website and things like that. That's totally fine. But be careful not to embarrass somebody about what they said 20 years ago, because that could then become the complaint. That's what I think has happened in one or two cases where there is a private dispute in a family about false memories of abuse claims, and they're not really real. But what can go wrong is if you interfere in some way in their life by making it public, or if you making their employer known about the dispute. So you want to preserve your offspring's career. You want to prioritize their career and skills, actually, because that is almost as important as re-establishing a relationship. So keep it private. So those are my 10 points, and I've just got some more things to talk about before I finish this talk. The other thing that I was thinking about just as I was talking is what to talk about in those first discussions, right? So in the first trying to get contact with one of your offspring, is it good to say, I would like to set up a relationship with you again? Or is it better to say, I would like to have an open conversation with you? I think by saying I'd like to have an open conversation with you where you get to say what you want to say might be something that they can commit to, but asking for a relationship, that's too difficult for somebody who believes that they were abused. So I think it's better perhaps when you're recontacting them to ask for a open conversation and then take that step at a time, and then ask for an ongoing conversation too, right? And then as they get, you really want to give them disconfirming evidence that they've been separating themselves from, right? So if they believe that their grandma didn't love them, you just want to sow seeds with them in those discussions that, just by giving an honest reaction, by saying, are you kidding? She absolutely loved you when she looked after you from age 0 to 5. It was a lovely time, so you just want to honestly just say what you believe to sow a seed, and then your offspring makes a decision on what she believes, and it changes over time. It will take time, and you want to let her be her or him be in complete control over the decisions of what to believe, using their own critical thinking. Another idea I have is something that a lot of you have done who have lost offspring, is take the opportunity of somebody negating their responsibility and to take the opportunity for you to take responsibility that they have negated. So one way to do this could be to educate yourself in the specific belief system that your offspring has built up over time. And I say this because it's an opportunity, so somebody letting their responsibility go is an opportunity for you to take that responsibility and form it into a self-actualized life, right? So I think you can take this tragedy and turn it into a meaningful life, such as, you maybe educate people from what you've found as a result of your educating yourself on the specific therapy or belief system. And you can use it, like some people have at the British False Memory Society, to find meaning and to connect with others. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is it is possible to believe that you were abused in childhood without false memories. And the way that happens is a reappraisal of real events in a totally negative way, right? So what I mean is you have a real event that happened at age 6, such as bathing or something like that, and you don't misremember that in therapy, but you come to reappraise that as being inappropriate when it was not inappropriate in psychotherapy in adult life. So I want you to be aware of this new way of thinking, of the malleability of memory of emotion, how memories of happiness can be reappraised as being less happy than they were, how memories of distress are not reliable, so you can change your appraisals of your childhood and start to believe that you had more distress than you actually did. So I just want you to be aware that you may have somebody that you're trying to reconnect with that doesn't have false memories. They may just have a massive reappraisal that's very unfair, such as they could, for example, reappraise normal arguments that families have. I think you have to have arguments to resolve what the truth is, although those arguments, I mean in a technical sense, should not be shouting and so on. It should be civil. But, there's always a conflict in families about what is true, what is the best thing to do, what is the best career to take, what's the best degree to take, whether you should go to school or not, whether you should skip school. All of those are going to create arguments. Now, the thing about reappraisal is somebody who's been in a kind of victimhood psychotherapy may reappraise all of those normal arguments that were actually helpful in developing the mind and developing what's true and what's not. They may reappraise those arguments as being toxic, and they don't want to get into arguments again. So it is possible that the reason why people stay estranged is reappraisal of childhood, not false memories, right? So the central truth, there was an argument, or the central truth that your mother did help you bathe when you were 3 years old, so those are true, but they get reappraised as being that the bathing there was a sinister meaning behind the bathing behavior when there was not, or that the normal discussions that you had in developing your ideas as you were growing up become labeled as toxic or abusive, emotionally abusive, and so on. And there's some research that I'm thinking of right now that you could send to, or you could quote, that show that the categorization of trauma is malleable. That's Peyton Jones's dissertation in 2021 at Harvard showed how vulnerable we are to shifting our criteria of labeling what's traumatic. Especially if we have a good life, we start to call minor distress as traumatic. And my research and Linda Levy's research on how reappraisals of past events lead to misremembering the emotions around those past events. And one paper you might consider is my paper, which is Patihis, Herrera, and Cruz, 2019, on the malleability of memory of love towards mothers in childhood. So you can change your appraisal of childhood or your mother, and your memory of emotions towards that mother can change, or father. So I couldn't talk about anything traumatic in that study, so I had to keep it to a positive emotion, but you can see how that might happen, occur if you strongly reappraise your childhood as being abusive, which we're not allowed to do that in the lab, but it probably will result in negative emotions, memories of negative emotions going way up in such an unfair way. So you might have a child that enjoyed were full of joy throughout their childhood, and then at age 27 think that it was miserable. All right, especially it just depends on how severe the psychotherapy is. Another point I have here is that the world is challenging even when the virus is stopped. Even if you help your family member reverse the mind virus, I'm calling it here. So there's a mind virus of using unfalsifiable thinking. Even when you deal with that, there's going to be challenges, right? Such as building skills, building jobs, building a career. Hopefully your offspring will already have that, so it's not such a challenge. There's a lot of hard work that the offspring has to do, and that what you have to do if you need to build up skills for your own career. And even when you have undermined it, even when you have helped somebody become better critical thinkers, you have to take personal responsibility for your life, your income, your job. Your child has to take personal responsibility for their skills, their job, and their career. I think this is a very important point to make. So, because what I don't want to happen is for somebody to become a retractor, but to neglect building their skills, their job, and their career, or their relationship. It just depends what situation they're in, after they have become a retractor. So I think there's more to life than just becoming a retractor. It's not going to help everything. It's just going to solve one small problem, which was, well, a big problem actually, that you were thinking uncritically about this area of your life. But then you're still going to be faced with problems that I think we have to be honest with people who do become retractors. Becoming a retractor is not going to solve your problems. You're not going to be able to earn money from being a retractor. You're not going to be supported probably by being a retractor. People are going to be interested in your story, but it's not a career. So when you do become a retractor, I think you have to spend a lot of time building your skills because you've probably lost opportunities. In the meantime, building a job and a career, if you have to, right? So if you've already got that, this is not a concern. And you have to as a retractor, you have to work hard and take personal responsibility and really value income, right? So don't play the victim for a second time. So retractors have been thought that they were victim a first time, and then they feel that they're a victim a second time, this time because therapists victimize them. It's kind of true, but you don't want to have victimhood as your central identity as a retractor. You want to say, okay, now there's an opportunity for me to use these new critical thinking skills to provide value to others in society and to have a good career, or to choose a partner well and then have a nice family, So there's a lot to do after retraction. And the other idea I have here is not to jump, for the retractors, not to jump from the pseudoscience frying pan into the fire by not building up their critical thinking skills. I think I might have mentioned this already. So have enough critical thinking skills so that you don't jump from repressed memory therapy into a new religious movement or something like that. Established religious movements are probably more reliable than cults, but still, the critical thinking skills you should gain should allow you to distinguish between science and pseudoscience in all areas of science, biology, viruses, vaccines, and so on. So it can cause, if somebody is in another pseudoscience, that can cause estrangement too, right? So if they get it dragged into a pseudoscience about vaccines and you don't agree with them, they may become estranged from you again, right? So critical thinking skills are important. Now, I say this next point here is that I think when you're working towards trying to gain a relationship or a conversation with an offspring, is for males and females to take a joint approach. You know, allow males to take their approach, as long as it's civil and polite and warm and communicative. They're going to have different ideas about how they regain access, regain a conversation with their offspring, and then some females in the family may say, no, don't do it that way. I just allow, don't block one of the ways of getting. I think you need to have a joint approach. Mothers and fathers working together to be effective, right? And you want to have different kind of shades of approach. And different, one time one person tries, the next time the other parent tries, just to see which type of approach, is it direct and assertive that works? You want to actually try that, or is it very empathetic and not assertive? Does that help? You want to try that too. So don't stop the males in your family from approaching the problem. Don't stop the females in your family to trying to fix the problem. Okay, because I think they have slightly different approaches to it that might help. All right, so another thing to say about when you lose somebody in this way to a belief system is that understand that it might be a kind of power play. And, because think about it, we have all probably, when we become adults, this urge to get to the top of the immediate hierarchy, which can include family. I don't think it's unusual for young people to try and to gain power from their parents. And accusing them of being bad parents is one way to really undermine the ability of the parent to be to be elders and respected elders in the hierarchy. So, in that sense, I think it's good to encourage a return to the morality that we had, decades ago, of respecting elders as being part of our culture, right? So I think this maybe is being lost, but that's certainly what I have now. So even if I am a professor, anybody in my family who is older than me is somebody I look up to and I respect regardless of skills, and I defer to them on decision making as well. So that's something that I think you could assert when you're getting, that your offspring might respect you for that. I think it's a breakdown of culture when that doesn't happen. So I think, the brutal way that parents are falsely accused, sometimes it might be driven by a desire to dominate and be independent. And of course, allow your offspring to be complete in control of their lives. Don't make any conditions on reconnecting with them. They do want to retain their power and their independence. So take that into account. But, at a certain point of time, you could say that I think you should respect your elders and explain why you think that's the case. Now, another point I have here that I'll kind of figure out what I meant as I read it is replace the mismatch of Freudian and other nonsense with scientific and universal liberalism. Yeah, I think this is important to say. So they will have a belief system that is kind of Freudian or modern trauma dissociation that is just grounded in a kind of subjectivism, a kind of belief that what feelings are more important than facts, and what you feel can outride facts, and you don't look for disconfirming evidence, you just look for confirming evidence, and you can believe what you want. You want to replace that. You don't want to just block that and eliminate that in somebody's critical thinking, but you want to replace it with something better, such as scientific thinking and what I call universal liberalism. So that's the philosophy of free speech, civil discourse, not interrupting speech, not shouting, not getting angry. It's the idea that you get out all the ideas into the public domain, into the open, get out all the ideas into the open, and then they act like a marketplace of ideas where the good ideas fade away, and there's a consensus that those bad ideas fade away, and the good ideas survive. So that's how I think about it. I think there's a wonderful moral system of universal liberalism or scientific liberalism that is a good replacement for Freudian kind of thinking. And you have to remember that Freudian kind of thinking is kind of similar to the abandonment of Enlightenment thinking, right? So Enlightenment thinking was that truth is objective, you must get to that truth, science must be objective. And then there was a backlash to that Enlightenment in the 19th century, and Freud is kind of in that idea of subjectivism, creating theories from clinical observations without testing them. It is a kind of a rebellion against the Enlightenment, and what I'm suggesting is going back to some of the really good ideas of universal liberalism, such as free speech. You analyze all the ideas and you allow people freedom to criticize those ideas. You have open discourse. Okay, so that's to replace this kind of subjectivism. Another thing to say is to highlight forgiveness. This is lacking in victimhood culture, right? So if somebody does something wrong, even if it's a slight, you never forgive them, and that's kind of a new virtue in victimhood culture, even if it's slight. So this is one of the moral ideas to communicate with an offspring, is that forgiveness is actually a good thing. We all have to forgive each other. The parents in this case have to forgive the child for hurting them so much. The child has to forgive the parents for not being perfect, which is probably true. And I don't think there's any perfect parents. So even if false memories are debunked in a relationship, there's still some forgiveness for imperfect parenting, because parenting is almost impossible to get right because of the emerging impulses that children have to be independent and not to listen to parents. As they mature, there's this impulse to be independent that makes it so difficult. Forgiveness is a virtue to try and get back into culture, which is kind of lacking right now. And also another moral idea here is to emphasize truth, to emphasize a truth orientation over feelings. So it's the idea that the truth is just a little bit more important than feelings. Feelings are a very, very close second, so you try the best to preserve feelings, but truth comes first, right? And try and emphasize that, try and get an agreement that truth comes before feelings, before the discussions and so on. And I think that, if you get people on board with that, do you agree that, in our discussions, we're going to try and put truth just a little bit higher than feelings? I think it can lead to better discussions, more progress. And Another thing is to give honest reactions. Do not be afraid to say what you're feeling. That's true. That's civil, right? So, for example, if your child says, oh, I remember that you didn't love me at age 5, give an honest reaction because it will sow a seed. Say, you must be joking, I was absolutely, I absolutely adored you, and then say, we did this together, just give an honest reaction. Don't expect them to change their mind straight away. It'll set a seed and it'll help them 2 years later in their slow reappraisal. All right. So just be honest. Just say, do you remember this, this trip that we took? It was great. I remember you this way. Just give them honest reactions. It'll set a seed and they'll respect you for it. Another thought here is do what is best for your family in the long term. I think this will give you a lot, your genetic family, I think it'll give you a lot of comfort to do this. You probably, if you're anything like me, you will probably have the instinct to do this, right? So you'll have the instinct that even though my child has been so awful to us for the last 10 or 20 years, I still want her to thrive. And that's a good instinct. I think that actually makes sense. So you still want her to be a beneficiary of your will, for example. Or you still want her children or your grandchildren to benefit from your wisdom or your finances, and you want so make decisions in that way. I don't think you should reject genetic kin just because, even if they are wrong about you, I feel like there's some responsibility to wish them well and to help them. And I only say this for your benefit. I think it will feel better to you if you forgive them and set them up the best way you can. Set up the generations that are to come after you, to set those generations up the best you can, because it will feel very good for you to do that. So be very forgiving, I think. Even if people still think you're a really bad person, still try and do good. I think that is something you can be kind of proud about. You feel really good about it. You might think about the end of The Dark Knight Rises, how everybody thought the Dark Knight was really bad, but actually he was a hero, but nobody knew he was a hero. So I think that is what I'm thinking of here, is to, even if people believe that you're a terrible person, be like this silent hero in the background. And finally, I touched on this earlier. I just wanted to talk about, what do you do? The main problem probably is the practicalities of how to meet, the practicalities of how to write that email, the practicalities of how to write that letter that you're going to send to them, the practicalities of where you are going to meet in person, right? I think that is probably one of the biggest problems of reuniting the family. Is that it's difficult to get people together to talk, even in families that do not have this drama of false memories or reappraisal of childhood. It's just people don't want to talk. They love entertainment more. They are not available during they're not available during their workplace, and then they're too tired, during their off time. So I think it's really difficult to set up the practicalities of communicating. So I think that is probably one of the things that you can change and you can focus on to make it happen. Just think of harmonious families that live in different cities or live far apart. They may not meet very often just because of those practicalities too. So I think that is a key to making contact is how to word things is a practicality, where to meet is a practicality. Do both of you have Zoom? You know, and that kind of thing. Okay, I've talked enough. I'm not sure how I'm going to edit this. I'm tired of editing videos. I've been doing it all semester. But I hope this is useful to just one person, and I'll be very happy if it helps. Okay, thank you. Bye for now.